Welcome to Placecast, a local policy innovation partnership hub production based at the University of Birmingham. Placecast is essential listening for those keen to explore the ins and outs of knowledge mobilisation for influence in central and local government, based on the view that it is only through animating the power of place-based leadership the wicked problems of 2025 can become more manageable. I'm speaking this morning with a real place-based leadership aficionado, Kersten England. Kersten has a more than 30-year career, had a lot of chief executive roles within local government, is the chair of the Young Foundation, and for our purposes, she's also Co Investigator on the Yorkshire Policy Innovation Partnership based out of the University of Leeds. Good morning, Kersten.
Morning, Nick. Nice to be with you.
Thank you very much. And obviously, we've known each other for a long time through various networks and things. I can't remember when we first met, but we've known each other for a long time. And you're most associated, I suppose, with doing the business in local government. Is that, can you tell me how that started and how that career began?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, interestingly, my career began in higher education when I was doing my doctoral studies at Manchester University. And I also ended up, I was teaching in the history department, I taught for the Open University, and I taught for the extramural department. So I kind of, but I guess I was a historical anthropologist. I was working on the impact of colonialism in Southern Africa. So I think I was wired from the beginning to have an intention for research to be purposed, to have impact in place, because I'd been a community activist, an anti-apartheid community activist before I went to university. Zimbabwe was becoming independent. That's what I studied. I then went to live, research and work in Zimbabwe for a while with collective cooperatives. And suppose that's where my sort of kind of first desire to see academic research have real world impact came from. Yeah. But then you have aged me, but it's absolutely, I'm not ashamed to say that was the early 1980s when there were no permanent academic posts. And I had a split decision whether I went south to be a research assistant for my professor who'd moved to Oxford, or I applied for a job in local government. And I ended up going into local government as a gender equality and organisation development officer. There you go. Not in the most central part of local authorities you might think, but I quickly got a passion for the difference that local government could make on a daily basis. And that's never waned, because I think that, the sector has held places together through very difficult times in the last 15 years, really, I would say, in all kinds of ways that are not generally recognised or celebrated, even as the monies have been reduced. So, yes. So I progressed in my career through kind of being involved with strategy and policy, and then I did some big service delivery. I did then work for government for a couple of years, and ultimately I became firstly chief executive in York and then latterly in Bradford, which is my sort of alma mater equivalent, if you like. That's where my heart was, in the brilliant district of Bradford, which is a phenomenal place.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm, as you know, a staunch Bradford, having had my first degree from Bradford as well. It's fascinating, I think, certainly some of the ways in which knowledge is structured within the academy, that community development kind of brackets global south and community development kind of brackets rest of our country, end up in slightly different areas of the forest. But I like you, having worked in community development and particularly and gender and place, in some ways it disrupts some of those binaries, doesn't it? That were kept apart, I think, by knowledge being structured in slightly different ways. So in some ways it's a sort of reintegration job all the time of taking what you know from one context to another. And I think that's definitely been one of the things that I have always really appreciated about conversations with you, is that it isn't always where you pick something up the same place as where you put it down,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've had multiple experiences in my life which I have used purposefully when I've been in the leadership of place type role. And also, we were lucky. Of course, you went to Bradford University, and you'll know this, had the first peace studies department in the world, right? And And that, that is internationally kind of engaged, connected. It's educated many of the politicians of the kind of the global south, actually, or policymakers of the global south. But because I was in Bradford initially in the 90s and early 2000s, we had a connection with peace studies. And so we created an interdisciplinary project called the Programme for a Peaceful City, which allowed practitioners and academics in Bradford to come together to discuss some of the, as you describe, intractable issues. And of course, that was a period of very difficult community relations. We had a number of riots. We were, the subject of kind of intense focus from central government around our work on cohesion. And being able to get alongside academics in the Peace Studies Department to collaborate on some of those issues and draw in international perspectives was phenomenally helpful. And I guess I already had a real openness to it because of my previous experience. But we went on to purpose that collaboration for other things, to look at water management in the Bradford district when we'd had floods, because there were great hydrologists at the university, and we had a commission of inquiry on water management, and the weatherman from the local radio station ended up fronting it and championing it. It was a really good experience for me of how you can bring the civic and the university, the academy together to work purposefully on the issues of place.
In a sense, it's kind of, it's natural to you, Kersten, but it's not natural to some people, I guess. And a lot of the work that LPIPs and the Hub have been engaged in is partly about codifying and bringing forward practice like this, which, as we know, can be done from within local government, can be done from within universities, but isn't always given the sort of profile that maybe it deserves. These are great examples. We've spoken previously about when the Macpherson inquiry did its hearings, and again, as an undergraduate student, it was completely natural to me to trot down from the university to the town hall to piece together the kind of high politics of a government inquiry with the kind of lived experience of people.
Of people in place, yeah.
And I feel like these are lessons that again, my own passion, as you know, it feels like there needs to be a sort of handbook almost. This is how you do it. This is how to, again, you need to mobilise people from across different sectors, but also if you are truly in service of place, those binaries they're just non-existent, really. They don't help you.
No, I mean, if you are a leader of place, then one of your core responsibilities, I think, is to understand the DNA of place and the asset base of place and bring it together in the service of the kind of the prosperity and well-being of the place now and for the future. I mean, that's a lot of words, and I've just got a cat jumped on the side. Sorry, comedy moment. So, I've never been a great respecter of boundaries. I absolutely respect the frameworks we have to work in. I understand the different incentive structures and governance range and all of that. But actually, I've always felt part of our purpose was to create alliances across institutions, and to, as far as is possible, disregard hierarchy and kind of institutional boundary, and as I've often said to colleagues, act first, ask permission after, or proceed until apprehended, as long as you're not going to break the law, right? I mean, I drew the line at that, but let's push the boundaries of what we can.
I don't know. I mean, you have been an anti-apartheid campaign.
Well, that is true. Well, I know. I mean, that is also true. I grew up understanding that the legislative framework some people live within is entirely unjust. And that's the other early lesson. So, but it would far be it for me to say to people, break the law. We're in an interesting moment on that one, aren't we?
Well, that I got into a lot of trouble for advocating the slashing of the seats on the Elizabeth line for northern taxpayers on the basis of the
exactly.
lack of justice.
I know. I mean, I would just note in parenthesis, I was always a legal observer when I went to Greenham Common, because I knew I had to get to Zimbabwe to do my PhD, and it wouldn't be great if I had been arrested. So, but I was participating in some of that way back in the early 80s.
But also, in all seriousness, understanding sort of the positionality, viz. Justice and economic justice, certainly, that does emerge out of being radically engaged in deep work on place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, I've been very lucky because both the places in which I was chief exec had universities that in different ways have played a very significant part in supporting some of the agendas of place. So when I was in York, And of course, York has got the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but also had Kate Pickett, who'd done the spirit worked on the spirit level. I mean, and much debated, but I actually think there's some real kind of sense in the work of Richard and Kate around income inequity, yeah, as opposed to sheer deprivation. And when we created our Fairness Commission, the then Archbishop of York, Joseph Rowntree, and Kate and Richard both all sat on that Fairness Commission alongside businesses, Nestle as it was, and the council. And we became a living wage city, and we started to look at issues of economic justice within a place that is widely seen as very affluent, but has actually pockets of intense deprivation, and that difference produces particular challenges that we needed to address, and we ran it through all of our policy making. I was very lucky to have that to draw upon, and then obviously when I went to Bradford, I've already referenced Programme for a Peaceful City, but the Born in Bradford project had been up and running. I was actually coincidentally involved in the early 2000s on a commission on infant mortality in Bradford, which led then to the birth of Born in Bradford, whose kids are now turning 18. But that is a longitudinal cohort study which is producing phenomenal insights that are having impact at place level, and now also informed by bringing communities, peer researchers together to look at things like neighbourhood design, air quality, physical activity, access to good, affordable, fresh food, and has ultimately, that initial investment has drawn in about £120 million of additional programmatic funding to make interventions in place. So I guess I've been very privileged and lucky to have access to those assets. But I suppose it's one thing to say to anybody in a place leadership, think about the assets you have in your place, the networks you have, where you reach further than your grasp. Think about that.
That's such a good point. And I think certainly in the mid-90s, there was so much about your network capacity being actually more important than your sort of statutory functions in a sense. And I do think I certainly, in terms of the way that I've always worked, a few trusted allies who might be across sectors, their career moves, their lives move them around. But essentially, if you've had a good experience working together in different contexts, to kind of get the band back together kind of under different headings is always really helpful.
It's always really helpful. I agree. I mean, I absolutely think, networking is a fundamental skill. The challenge then is to start to wire it more systematically into the governance strategy and policy making place so that it survives changes of leadership within institutions, so it becomes a way of working. And I think that's part of what the LPIPs, if they're really successful, could lead to. Yeah. So having the academy present in the governance structures, the partnership governance structures of place, in the subsidiary strategy and policy development making, do you know what I mean, in collaborative space, has been also incredibly important, and also co-investment in the infrastructure that sustains some of the work on data, evidence, analysis, do you see what I mean, which is really part of the underpinnings. Yeah.
Good. Well, it seems like we're in the right room. So as you've described, this has been a long career full of insight and kind of interesting reflections. So when did you first engage with the LPIP process? You've mentioned its use in terms of anchoring. So when did you first come across?
Okay, so there's a little bit of a prehistory to this, because during the pandemic, I was by then chairing the Yorkshire and Humber Chief Execs Group in local government, and a very good colleague of mine, Vice Chancellor, was chairing the Yorkshire Universities Network. And we actually, through the pandemic, many places grew closer to the universities. Because all bets were off. We weren't doing normal stuff, were we? We were just trying to take our places safely through, and that included how do you keep students safe and learning, but on a broader bit, how do you recover the economy? So lots of interesting connections either were built on or were fired up afresh during the pandemic. And we had a conversation about the fact that Yorkshire has 12 HEIs, a number of them Russell Group, producing world-class research and evidence. Others are more vocationally focused, but actually do really interesting research around economic growth and sectoral growth, I would say. And were we harnessing the kind of power of that collectively. So actually what that resulted in was a memorandum of understanding between Yorkshire universities and Yorkshire and Humber councils. And I'd say we started to lay the foundations for what has become LPIP. But that is fair to say, and I do have a thing about trying to integrate the Civic universities' work alongside the innovation, and policy engaged research work. Because our MOU was around shared advocacy and collaboration around issues that, kind of whether it was student visas at the time or whether it was transport needs, but also widening participation, universities, anchor institutions, the usual stuff, as well as research capabilities. So we laid that down, which resulted, and this is in part, I think, why our LPIP bid was successful. We then secured money from Research England, as you probably know, to create a policy engagement and research network, which put policy fellows into all universities to build stronger connecting bridges between. And whether that then resulted in the development of areas of research interest by places, or whether it was more responsive, kind of one-off pieces of work, that programme enabled support to the development of local growth plans and combined authorities and emerging, as critical friends or doing focused pieces of work, working on things like poverty truth commissions in York, working programs around women entrepreneurs or the early years and childcare system, just to take a few examples. And I think what that started to do was create a continuous dialogue between, both chief execs and vice chancellors, but beneath that, between those people responsible for policy and strategy within local and combined authorities, and also pro-vice chancellors and academic researchers in particular disciplines, and taking it into the social sciences. I think there's been more of this policy engaged work between the health service and academic, because the research infrastructure in the health system has been sustained. It's, let's look at where the big research monies go. They do go to breakthrough discoveries around drugs, therapeutic treatments, acute and chronic. Much less has gone upstream. And so we started to bring new disciplines into play who'd had less experience, perversely, really, in engaging with the civic sphere. But it's fair to say local government has been stripped bare, and that has included the policy and strategy functions and data functions have been stripped bare. So it's also a real opportunity to start to create between us a capability that can be deployed in place. So when the opportunity came up to apply for one of the LPIP awards, it felt like a natural progression. We'd got a collaboration agreement. We'd now built a bit of an infrastructure. This was an opportunity to work on particular thematic areas. I've always described the first investment was to create an infrastructure. The second one gives us money to do work on regional inequalities, social, economic, and environmental well-being. Yeah, of course, it was through the last administration, so they were using the levelling up language, which has largely disappeared. We'd also say inclusive growth, foundational economy, however you want to describe it. Not a lot of which is happening at the moment in national policy terms. Maybe come back to that. So we took that kind of track record, if you like, and some examples of how smallish, and I don't mean that the money through LPIP is small, but smallish investments overall has a gearing effect on mainstream allocation of resource and policy, to create real change. And that's, I think, a compelling story that research in and of itself is not going to change the world, but if it's research married to kind of rewiring how you think about how you make an intervention in place and the policy approach to it, you can achieve real scale differences, as particularly I would say Boring Bradford has shown over 18 years, whether it is around air quality or physical activity or access to fresh food.
Just sort of prehistory to the actual LPIP showing up. So Yorkshire Universities itself was emerging out of almost informal networking, but out of necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
The YPIP itself was the Research England piece, and that was about systematising a bit of that.
Yeah.
The LPIP is one of the programmes that sits within YPIP.
Yeah.
In order to try to sort of, and it had its specific areas of foci. So could you explain a little bit more then about the Yorkshire LPIP and its actual areas of focus?
I can, yeah. And of course, as you know, Nick, there are 4, and you're going to cover all 4, and they all have quite different contexts. But the other 3, it's fair to say, work under devolved administrations with, and I say this, relatively stable, I mean, you can't say that about Northern Ireland particularly, but much more settled arrangements and proximity to their devolved administrations. Yeah,
this has been the sort of surprise thing that we found actually working within the LPIP itself is that, and we can speak for millions of hours about this. The devolution arrangements outside of England are relatively mature now. Since they were sort of first Blair Brown term innovations. The Senedd is reaching a 7th general election next year, which obviously is highly contested, but the processes through which the universities can kind of match with the nations of the UK seems to be, a big success. My own work has always been about subnational economic development in England, which I'm currently describing as a bin fire. So the notion that at the Yorkshire scale there are institutions that can map relatively easily. The hope then is that within a wider kind of English kind of disaster when it comes to capacity, as you've described within local government. Also, the one thing that we haven't mentioned, neither was central government commissioning any research. So the whole notion that, early in my career, what MHCLG, as what DER wanted to know, that contract research kept chunks of the university that were more engaged with policy alive for a long period of time. In the same period, as local government was being starved out, there wasn't a lot of policy engaged research being commissioned by central government either. But in the Yorkshire context, so the LPIP sits within those, we would say, they're spaces of opportunity, hopeful spaces, but they're not tethered in the same way to statute or to...
Absolutely not. No, exactly. And for some, the concept of Yorkshire as a region is contested in of itself, and its boundaries and its geographies and, the history that's bound up with that. Nonetheless, there is an understanding across Yorkshire that we have legitimate and shared concerns, that actually we are a great demonstrator because we've got highly, densely occupied urban areas, we've got sparsely settled rural areas, upland areas, we've got coastal areas, we have utility and natural infrastructure which is completely interconnected and related, and we have a brand, and so therefore we're great as a demonstrator. And, and of course, we're the size of Scotland. She says it behoves me to say population base of Scotland, if not the geography, right, the geographical size. And also, we reflect all kind of political administration. So if you want to test out how you make something work in different contexts, So, and we have 12 HEIs, all of which have something to bring to the party, which is, I think, a hefty asset base in terms of the academy. That said, as you just pointed out, we're working in a shifting pattern of multi-level governance, right, which we're having to grapple with, and a time of precarity in both the academic sector and local government. So all of that is part of the piece. I think that makes even more the case for collaboration. And our LPIP has a number of areas of focus. I'll just run through those very quickly and a bit of what we've been doing in each. So the first, and I think really exciting, is that whole thing about data, democratising access to and use of data. Yeah. Now, particularly pertinent in a moment of kind of, swimming in data, but not in analysis, and swimming in disinformation and misinformation and questions about evidence and the veracity of evidence, and expertism, actually. So I think quite important is to put at the disposal of communities, businesses, civic authorities, pretty sophisticated data, correlated data sets, which can be interrogated and used for multiple purposes, to actually start to craft policy and strategy interventions, strategy priorities and policy interventions. And so we've created something called the Yorkshire Engagement Portal, which people can go on and have a look at. We'll put the web link. You could maybe put the web link because I just can't remember. And have a play with it because it's something that was commissioned by local authorities, so it's responding to that need. It's something that's already garnered real interest nationally from some of the research councils to think about, what might this have scalability? Might we be able to use this as a framework for looking at regional and national data? Yeah. And so that's great. And, it's in its first iteration. So I think that's the other thing I would say is, so take a look at that. The second area I would talk about is the whole thing around a just transition to net zero. Now, of course, when you mentioned I'm chair of the Young Foundation, we launched the Just Institute with the University of Manchester. We're not the only people working in this space, and it's important, I think, not to try and claim uniqueness. However, Yorkshire does have the biggest climate commission, which is a quadruple helix kind of collaboration, actually, between public, private, voluntary and community, faith sector, trade unions, all coming together. It's been sustained by Yorkshire universities and local authorities since its inception, and doing fascinating work through YPIP funding around retrofit, bringing, both citizens' juries into play, looking at the kind of from the perspective of residents, users, because the whole, the market is not working, but also bringing together planning, producing real practical frameworks for retrofit that allow planners, heritage officers, people advising in retrofit, people working in the market, the private sector around retrofit, and those, people living in pre-1919 terraces to start to wrestle, because at the rate we're going, we're not getting very far on retrofit, let's be really honest. But also projects looking, and I think this is the point, at issues at the moment, like the requirement to produce nature recovery strategies across all places. Yeah, how can we build those actually with the views and voices of community and business, and looking at land and water use management proactively, rather than it being the domain of the experts, having a co-produced collaborative approach to that, doing some fascinating work around economic development and sphagnum nos on the moors. I mean, it's our LPIP is wide-ranging, let's just put it that way, but it is plugging into issues of the moment, policy and programmatic priorities of the moment, and bringing all voices into play alongside really good structured evidence, rigorous thinking, but valuing contributions of others as well. Which is
so what you're describing, it just seems like a kind of sort of how scholarship ought to work. Do you have any reflections on how? I mean, what's fabulous about the LPIP is that you're able to tool somebody up with the research question and with the partnerships, bit of data, and that sort of flexibility. Do the academics talk to you about why it is that they felt constrained about not working in this way in their normal lives?
So we're on a journey, right, aren't we? And it's not been without its challenges, right? So we've lost some academics along the way because actually their positions have been made redundant. Yeah. We have grappled with the fact that the career structures in universities don't incentivize this work. Yeah. And I think that's a big issue. And we've wrestled at times with language, othering, if I was to put it that way, and parity of esteem. And that's not one way. That's just to say that, sometimes people think academics are ivory tower academics out of touch with reality, that use overly complicated language, which is inaccessible and exclusionary. That's, academics who speak about people reverentially with lived experience, but it's a way also of marginalizing. Do you know what I mean? And so we have wrestled with all of those things, how secure people are in their career, how much they can step outside of their discipline. It's not all that helpful to start talking about being a heterodox economist when you're working with a community panel looking at inclusive growth. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So we've wrestled with the institutional cultures, some of the disciplinary cultures, some of the security people have, and the incentives that they have. And similarly, we've wrestled with some of the kind of perceptions and stereotypes that exist of academics. So and that's a continuous journey, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? And at times,
I'm always advocating that people understand that academic precarity can mean that good people who never get over the hump, in some ways, all the things that we're describing, have been put to me as career suicide, because getting to the heart of a discipline and publishing like man, mad
Yes.
has been how people have secured themselves.
Exactly.
And I think there's enormous potential for working in this way that we're describing, in having transforming a culture and transforming place. But
Yeah.
it can be difficult, and it can be lonely, and it
It can
can
be
be.
difficult and lonely, absolutely, and you have to build your allies, and yet you have to protect your well-being. Because I know a lot of very good academics who are completely on board with it, but they're strung out. They're working all hours, because they're committed to this. But it's sometimes at the cost, as you say, of their career development or their well-being, and that's not a great place to be. And some of the bigger institutions have more, they have more policy support fund monies that they can align. They have bigger infrastructures that absorb some of the overhead costs. But some universities are really at the margins of viability, and that makes it exceptionally tough. So, I mean, just on the YPIP, because of course I've
Yes.
described part of what we're doing.
Yes.
It's all right. So I'll briefly just say we're doing a heap of work around the inclusion and sustainability of the cultural sector, much debated at the moment. One of the more marginal kind of sectors in the economy, but certainly features in government thinking, certainly features in combined authority thinking, and of course taking the opportunity of Bradford being City of Culture this year. But it's an area where the kind of rhetoric and policy development is wide of how do you actually provide decent pathways to participation in the cultural sector. Yeah.
Just to be clear, because another of your hats is that you
Yeah,
are the chair of the BD25 Year of Culture in Bradford,
I am.
which
But we're not evaluating that as such. We're just saying, look, it's a case study of a place that's decided that the cultural sector is key, not the only sector, but it's an important priority in the journey to prosperity. Yeah. So what are the conditions, and trying then to feeding into One Creative North, the combined authorities local growth plans. Some combined authorities, I think, are going to take the creative sector as one of their LIP priorities. So can we make, one of my concerns is that bridge between work on the foundational economy and what appears to be emerging as the preoccupations of LIP funding, the Local Innovation Partnership Fund, because they, at least on face value, look as though they're quite distinct and disconnected. And I don't think you can tackle regional inequality unless you continue to look at the kind of whole ecosystem for growth. And that means looking at foundational economy issues, which, to be fair, our YPIP is much more grounded in those than what would appear to be the kind of priorities of the LIP, if I would say.
Then I guess that's a weakness and a strength, because being able to neatly segue into a LIP delivery kind of model would suggest it's exactly the same as the old money, industrial strategy being top down, but local growth plans being bottom up, and there's a missing sort of middle level in terms of strategizing. Absolutely, and I think LIP needs to be seen as much more of a continuation of sort of industrial strategy type funding, rather than all the things that we're describing. And it is frustrating, because as it is kind of coming in at the same time as the LPIP is kind of explaining the difference between the sort of approaches, does fall to projects, and that is quite difficult. It is difficult for anyone to understand kind of why.
Yeah, and there's a hearts and mind job to do with combined authorities, isn't there, around, as even as weak as the subnational settlement is, those monies that they have discretion over, the gain share monies, the headroom that they have to actually make investments around foundational economy, is really important. And if the work we're doing through YPIP can play a part in that I think will be a result in and of itself. I mean, just to finish off, I do think one of the more unique features of YPIP by comparison with the others, and not a competition, because I think we're learning from each of the ways we're all undertaking our work, is that we have a 30-strong community panel drawn from across Yorkshire of people from all backgrounds, lived experience, demographic, who are working alongside us in the governance structure, informing the work programmes, providing challenge support and wider contributions, which is really illuminating, and learning a lot from that in and of itself. But one of the key things we've done as a result is to invest in 22 community-led research projects right across the region, which, and I think, there, some of our research is almost like academic initiated at best. What we're doing is co-producing the research focus and methodologies with system actors, not to use too much jargon here, but anyway. But then the community-led research is actually initiated by community organisations, and we're wrapping academic support around it, and we're going to learn what the strengths and weaknesses are of each approach. Do you see? I think that will be interesting in
Yeah.
and of itself. Yeah.
And in a sense, I guess it would be about then blending and blurring the edges so something doesn't feel like a
Indeed.
community project and something doesn't feel like
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
it,
No, so we're creating a whole, certainly I'm leading one of the work projects. We're going to have a whole team approach of about 40 people coming together. Some are system actors, community activists, some are academics, and some are businesses working around the cultural sector. So that, and some of them will be delivering the community-led research, some of them will be, but it's developing that parity of esteem, that sharing between the synergies, yeah, which is going to be important.
It's
Yeah.
absolutely brilliant. So tell me, let's imagine then. I mean, as you've said, Yorkshire's the same size as Scotland. Imagine you had the 70 billion that it looks like Scotland has on paper for economic affairs. I realise that anyone working north of the border would shoot me if I was suggesting that I have a generous settlement. But I've been doing some work just recently on, that is essentially the identifiable spend north of the
Yeah,
border.
yeah.
What do you think is the potential for the power of place work reaching maturity, becoming fully embedded? Imagine you had that kind of budget. What do you think you could change as a result, and what would the size of that prize be in the Yorkshire context?
Wowzer. Well, those are really big questions. I mean, I think at the moment, I'm partly focused on ensuring we deliver as we've committed to. Yeah, but but within that, with YPIP colleagues and even UPenn colleagues, yeah, University Policy Engagement Network, and who have some. I'm just getting up to speed with all this as a kind of person who hasn't worked in university for a long time, all these different acronyms. But anyway, there is some national funding to look at that university policy engagement and research and policy engagement. We're building the case for a sustained infrastructure that enables that collaboration between the academy and the civic sphere, and bringing together business and community around some of the big challenges for Yorkshire and brokering the best academic support into place. Yeah, because it doesn't always reside in the particular place. Yeah, and actually we'll go beyond the borders of Yorkshire if necessary. But I think that actually would be the biggest prize from the success of YPIP if there's sustained investment and support. And we are creeping towards a commitment from both the higher education sector and civic sector to fund a core. So you'll get something that was there a Policy Scotland? I mean, there's certainly international examples where there are.
Yeah, Policy Scotland feeds the executive and was based
Exactly.
at the University of Glasgow, and it as you describe, has some institutional heft.
Yeah, exactly. Institutional heft has a place at the governance structures such as they are for Yorkshire, bearing in mind they're voluntary. Yeah, but there is a kind of Yorkshire and Humber leaders group, Yorkshire and Humber vice chancellors group. And they are working on shared priorities and agendas. Yeah, and having capacity and capability to support places, whether they're local, sub-regional or regional. Yeah, to kind of both craft policy interventions or run campaigns and provide advocacy into the national. Yeah, I think that would be the big prize. I mean, my hope would be that through doing that, we could build a more coherent approach to economic growth that seeks to deliver prosperity that is more more equitable, because actually I think ultimately that costs less to the public purse. Yeah, and that's the big prize, is that what we see across just about all parts of Yorkshire, is failure demand, right? That is neither use nor ornament to national government or our places or the ability of people to live flourishing lives. I mean, that's a bit grandiose, isn't it? But that's what we're trying to get out of this, a kind of enduring capacity and capability with heft, which can support the effectiveness of kind of leadership at regional and sub-regional and local level. Gosh,
is that all, Kersten?
Well, no, I mean, that's a life's journey, isn't it? Let's face it. So that's why I said at the moment I want YPIP to live up to all its promises. Yeah, for us to learn from the things that go really well that could be scaled and replicated, but also to learn from what didn't go as well, because that's absolutely right. Yeah. And then to seek a legacy which wires the way of working in for the future.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So I guess we've spoken about a lot of things that you've worked on over your career that have got elements of this within them, such as Born in Bradford. And we've talked about how to distill some of the lessons from the LPIP. Do you have any good international lessons that you think are working well in the multi-level way that we could import or steal?
Yeah, I mean, well, and I would like to learn more about them, right?
Yes, okay.
Do you know what I mean? No. And it's one of the things that I do want to look more. I mean, I'm aware of models increasingly in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavia, even Italy, and places where actually there are legislative arrangements which incentivize, because I do think this is in part about shifting the way universities are regulated, what they're inspected on meaningfully, what they're assessed on, how their money flows, the incentives for career academics. I do think it is in part dependent on actually monies being allocated by local and sub-regional authorities that understand the importance of evidence analysis, policy development, which of course they do, but the money has just withered and withered and withered. Yeah, capabilities have withered.
But you're absolutely right. Now, certainly, and I mean, the other thing that's slightly unsatisfying is that in general, as we've been just talking about for the whole conversation, where there are better federal relationships or better two-tier relationships, then you've got much more to hang, so like a lot of the examples in the States will be universities of various stripes, but they dock very neatly with either the mayoralties or
That's right.
federal, the actual places that they are.
Yeah.
So like Carnegie Mellon, which is often discussed, which
Yeah.
Robin Hambleton did a lot of work on, which was incredibly civic oriented. It has a place at the table, a permanent place at the table within a level that we don't necessarily have.
Well, of course, what's significant about all of that? More meaningful devolution. I mean, thus to this point in the United States, not to dwell on what's happening now, the kind of federal government has always had a level of autonomy and an ability to invest that's kind of not dependent on the national administration, is it? Yeah, and we still haven't seen that delivered in England in the way that we'd
my
imagine.
great mentor Alan Harding, no country's ever become federal by mistake.
No. Yeah, no.
And I think again, without wishing to dwell too much on the problem of England, we are, it is in this sphere that England, there's so much capacity to animate the higher education resources of England in the pursuit of a kind of English set of questions.
Yeah.
I just think that.
And sadly, I think I was going to say administrations in England have become less outward facing, almost as a result of the devolution to the four nations. So certainly in other arenas, I'm constantly checking, well, what are they doing in Scotland? What are they doing well? Because the policy environment has shifted quite significantly. As someone who goes up and down Scotland lots because of still having family and parent there, I'm always struck by some of the moves that have been made around economic investment, around migration, around child poverty. You just have to look at that kind of whole landscape. And I'm not going to comment whether it's better or worse. It's just more determined on certain agendas, isn't it?
And I think that's right. And I mean, even, I was in the House of Commons library when the initial first move of devolution in the mid-90s, and there was some discussion of parliamentary scrutiny of then what was different within the different nations of the UK. But ultimately that fell over because it was kind of, why would that happen? Because you don't have a feedback mechanism back into Parliament. You don't actually have it for legislation in general. It's supposed to be an arrow that goes out. But actually what's happening now is you've got multi-speed policies doing multiple different experiments in multiple different areas.
Yeah.
And there is nowhere for that to bend round again into learning for other parts of the UK. I think huge era. So in your own, it sounds like a huge project in terms of LPIP, etc. But what are you working on next? With these lessons and with this knowledge.
Well, I think I might have spoken about that already, which is, I am really keen that what we secure as a legacy is a sustained capacity and capability, to deliver great policy engaged research, right? That makes a difference, that can be scaled and replicated. Definitely something I'm working on. Of course, I'm working on lots of different fronts. So because because I'm chairing Bradford City of Culture, because I'm chairing the Young Foundation, I'm also a commissioner on the National Preparedness Commission and on the National Literacy Trust. So we've got some big stuff on in those arenas as well. This is me personally, and I'm speaking, Nick, which I hope is relevant.
Actually, knowledge is embodied, so that's why we don't just read the website out.
Yeah. So actually, the National Literacy Trust has just landed a commitment from the government to put a library into every primary school by the end of the Parliament. Huge. That's huge, actually, as a move, and we're working hard to be part of delivering that, and also a National Year of Reading. And because my mother was a writer, that's something I feel pretty passionate about, the access to literacy and the kind of love of reading and all of that. So I am working away championing that. And I'm also, because for most of my career, I've worked on community resilience and emergency management, the National Preparedness Commission. I mean, to be serious for a minute, we are, I think, as a nation, less prepared than many nations for the precarity of our day-to-day life. Of course, we had the pandemic, but I don't think we've learned, or embedded many of the lessons from that. And we're in a very precarious world, which is characterized by, of course, misinformation, disinformation. It begs the question about evidence and experts and all the rest of it. Geopolitical conflict, environmental crisis. And so I am, I'm thinking quite a lot, and with my Young Foundation hat on, about community resilience and the fact that across the world, the global south, but also Australia, New Zealand, America, which are hit by extreme weather events regularly, or other places hit by geopolitical uncertainty, how much more developed there is a framework that supports communities to play their part and become resilient, right? And take,
what used to be called civil contingencies.
Well, it is civil contingencies, but people still get laughed at when they say you should have a battery operator or a wind-up radio. You should have some batteries for your torch. You should have some, basic foodstuffs in, because you think you're going, that war is imminent. But actually, it's not ridiculous.
There's a lot of brittleness built into, that we've talked about precarity. We've talked about foundational economy, and again, I guess in quite a lot of households, they don't roll deep in terms of if and when the worst would happen.
Well, and rebuilding community infrastructure, mutualism, reciprocity, people knowing and watching out for each other. It might sound completely disconnected from all the stuff talked on YPIP, but I think it's pretty fundamental, given what's happening right now in our country in terms of disconnection, division. And part of that is actually about reinvesting in the community networks and infrastructure that actually kind of can carry a place in a time of crisis.
Absolutely. So and again, this is specific to you yourself. So the way that we kind of conceptualize it, on the higher education side, you've got brokerage, so knowledge brokerage.
Yeah.
And then on the sort of decision-making side, you've got place leadership. And my thing is, it's almost like it's a Lego brick. So your brokers need somewhere to Lego brick together with good place leaders. So you've described, obviously, your operating environment of Yorkshire. So real specifics. Can you think of people that you've worked with, and they can be really any time, who've demonstrated those qualities of good brokerage? And can you think, I mean, of course, it would be wonderful if they then neatly Lego bricked onto really good place leaders, but one thing at a time. So good brokers, good place leaders, please.
Okay. Well, and I would just say something, though, about the kind of regional infrastructure. So what we are doing, I'd like to get to the point where it's knowledge and policy co-production. Do you know what I mean? That doesn't mean then that it doesn't then to enter a decision taking arena. But I also think it's worth exploring the concept of decision making and decision taking, right? I think,
Oh,
yeah. Do you know what I mean? They're distinct processes. And we have recreated the policy officers network for Yorkshire, right, to try and provide a kind of a framing for that profession, which is not well supported in local government, and bring it alongside academics who are really interested in the process of policy formation and so on. So just to say that, yeah, I have worked with some of those people, and I'll talk about one who is a real operator, entrepreneur, whatever you call, networker, but kind of like has created momentum, which is
Is it me?
sustained. Is it you? Well, you are definitely one of those kinds of people. But actually, you probably know John Wright, who is the director of Born in Bradford, right? So he, at some point along the journey, got himself the title of Director of Research for Bradford District, right? He has many of the politicians on speed dial. He's got some of them sitting on his kind of research project governance. Yeah, he has his team wired into all aspects of the way that the place operates, whether it is the health and wellbeing board, whether it's the economic development partnership, whether it's the kind of sport and physical activity, or even the kind of city of culture. Some of his team have been supporting us to look at culture, the arts, and teenage health and well-being and things like that. And he's a very charismatic kind of individual who presents incredibly well, who creates momentum, who's built community and with peer and community research, with children as active participants in the research. He's built evidence which has shifted national policy. So he's got a very compelling story, but it's not just about him. He's built the capacity and capabilities beneath. But you can put him anywhere in front of any audience, and he has credibility. And we wouldn't have had an air quality action zone, charging clean air zone in Bradford, without the evidence that he and his team produced about the impact on asthma in children, COPD in later life, admissions to A&E, the cost to the Treasury, which unlocked 65 million from central government in the end. Do you see what I mean? So there's a very good example. I've worked for lots of great place leaders, actually.
And you are incredibly well networked across all the places that good place leaders go. So I wouldn't expect nothing less. But can you think of one or a number that you could shout out?
Oh, it's so invidious, this, isn't it? So I've worked with some great individuals. I mean, I think if you're talking about political leaders, are we talking about political leaders? Yeah, right now, I think Tom Hunt's and Chris Reid, they're doing a fabulous job. Well, and Steve Hart. I mean, I actually think the South Yorkshire crew have really got their act together, haven't they? Do you know what I mean? And it's been brilliant to see Sheffield emerge from some of its travails into a much clearer, get its chutzpah back, as I call it. Its mojo, get up and start talking about who it is, what its potential is, and collaboration. Of course, married with a great chief exec who is also very wedded to place leadership. But, Steve Horton has been plugging away at this stuff for, Barnsley leader. He's chaired the Yorkshire. He's very wedded to regionalism. He works across all political boundaries. He's always engaged with academics, actually, and from the Coalfields Alliance, I'm trying to remember what it was called, the Industrial Communities.
The Industrial Communities Foundation, Coalfields.
Yeah. I mean, the leader I work for in Bradford has worn out every pair of shoes she's ever had, kind of working across all government departments and with all parts of society to try and bring together coalitions of the willing for Bradford. Immense respect for her. I mean, it's hard. It's hard not to sit up when Andy Burnham talks, right? Even with all the other stuff that goes around it. Yeah. But he's brought a level of dynamism, imagination, innovation, radical thinking, which you may like or may not like. It may sit with government policy or not sit. It may step on the toes of local authorities. But I think it's positively disruptive on the whole.
As a Greater Manchester council taxpayer, we're definitely very supportive of Andy.
Well, and you see some of what's been, for all that I will challenge, previous colleagues about looking at the income deprivation levels, and where's the real focus and movement and all those things. But yeah, so yes, I can think of lots, actually, and lots of great chief execs that I've worked with who are innately wedded to making the most of the place they're in and not just institutional management. Yeah.
No, I think that, to be honest, that's exactly that's what frustrates me, is if and when local government is misunderstood as a series of institutions and levers and all the rest of it, because instinctively people that can work with the warp and weft of their place, particularly,
It's the warp and the weft. It's absolutely right. Yeah.
but that's the people that I'm drawn to, and the people whose careers that I follow, and the people that I surround myself with are those people that are able to do it in that way. And my sort of confusion is how there is the disconnect. And again, the civil service is very different, as you mentioned that when you were working nationally on neighbourhood renewal, the need to sort of unpick everything and start again with a blank piece of paper every 3 or 4 years is
Oh,
just so
listen,
difficult.
it's crazy. I mean, this is not to say everything under New Labour was brilliant, but I've oftentimes gone back to thinking about Talk Place, local strategic partnerships, sustainable community strategies, Sure Start, all those things. And if we had, sustained some of those approaches, yeah.
But it wasn't just at the neighbourhood level, because that was then plugged into the regional PSA target, and there was a target tree
Yeah,
that that there was a sort of sense that was made. And I think I
yeah,
was
yeah.
thinking actually, when you were talking about the National Literacy Trust piece, how open and welcoming this government would be of an initiative like that,
Mm.
but how hopeless in terms of designing the full set of institutions that would enable or ensure it. Do you see what I mean? Like
Yeah, yeah,
they're perfectly happy, in special pleading, always right side of the argument,
yeah,
but
yeah.
somehow they are really failing to design in. There's no design thinking in this government, as far as I can see. Even if you
No.
look at the recent, they can't even design the child abuse inquiry in a way which is able to stick, and that is the thing that worries me the most.
Well, there's lots of reasons behind that. One is also the decline in trust of and respect for politicians. The other is, of course, the distancing of the civil service from places, which has happened. I worked for a government office, right? I was director of local government for Yorkshire and the Humber. There was a middleware. Now, putting civil service campuses in cities and places like Darlington is great, and it is beneficial in some respects, but it's not the same as creating meaningful, abiding relationships between relatively senior civil servants and places. So I would say, when I worked across the government office, for better or ill, there was what were called then grade 5, which is relatively senior, directors of education, health, etc. And we all knew each other, and we all knew the places, and we could get alongside places and work with them in a meaningful way. That just you've lost those connecting pieces, and now what you get is people with varying levels of experience that move around a lot, that have never worked in localities, particularly if they're in the policy strategy roles. And there is a kind of class, generation, and geographical separation. Still,
Mm,
yeah, still.
right, that's right. And I mean, in some ways, and again, we will speak again, no doubt, about picking over the carcass of the various regional sort of experiments over the years. As you know, it isn't exactly that fun. But in the bit under which so in some ways the worst of the bonfire of the Quangos was the audit commission, on the basis that you know
Mm,
local government now, it isn't about marking its own homework. No one's marking its homework. You don't
no,
have
no.
accounts that are agreed for local government. The
Wow.
kind of
God.
immiseration of
I mean, the
everything.
audit function for local government, isn't it? I mean, and the audit commission actually was able to play a twin role at times, which was
Mm,
developmental and supportive as well as
exactly. It
regulatory.
was
And
it was
and now
both.
you get regulators who say, no, no, we don't do because it compromises the audit or the
Yeah.
regulation process. And you're like, well, where is the opportunity to wrestle with some of these big intractable issues or some of the policy
Mm.
approaches? I've had this with regulators, Ofsted and CQC, where some of the way it's structured is just completely perverse and counterintuitive to delivering what's right for people in place.
And this is exactly it, is that pro-place policy is pro-human policy.
Yeah,
And something's happened to our machine where it is where there are machine it's sort of
yeah,
machine input in and machine output out.
yeah,
But being able to, and another way of looking at it is, it's a crisis of the meta governance piece. So
yeah,
the
mm,
governing of government is appalling, and has been both centrally and locally
yeah,
for a really long time.
oh,
And
really,
again, we're not. It's not that it was the Elysian fields of New Labour, but there was a kind of clear narrative about actually what the different scales were going to do and how it was all going to pull together into a national mission.
Yeah.
And that is it that
I'm not seeing the infrastructure for delivery of the missions in a coherent way at the moment. I think it's fair to say.
No one is. Right. I'm going to let you, Kersten England, have a wave of my place-based innovation magic wand. Be careful with it. It can grant a wish. You have absolute power to do one of these things, but you must use your powers to make a tangible change to a specific place. Your change will be specific, measurable, actionable, recordable, and transferable. Smart magic is hard to get hold of at the moment and is subject to a 20% reducing multi-year budget settlement. You can have a £10 million project fund. Well, let's be real. Since we're talking about the scale of Scotland into Yorkshire, you can have a £70 billion project fund. You can have a half an hour with the central cabinet and a slide deck, although in your case I think it would more be a pointy stick. You can have editorial control of the front page of a tabloid. You can have a clause to insert into a bill, although I am prepared to allow you a whole bill if you need it. You're allowed a message that goes viral on TikTok. You're allowed anyone as an advocate for your work, or you're allowed the answer to something that's always bothered you. As you can see, this is partly just to sort of give it a bit of a shake and see what you think could really make a change in the context that you work in. So here you are, one wish.
God, and you know what? This is the hardest thing, one wish, because there's so many different things that I would... things I'd want to see in legislation, right, and things that I would want to, and I'm not going to go to the 70 billion. I'm
today.
Not today. No, and because you're granting me it, whatever, I think I'm actually going to talk about the community resilience framework, right? And actually, I want to look at a kind of regional and national framework for community resilience, which provides an infrastructure for mutualism and reciprocity between communities, provides access to the kind of training development that you get around civil contingencies, that provides some of the infrastructure at local level for places, organisations in place that can be there for, and also can leverage investment from insurance companies, community lottery fund and others to provide basic kit for communities and households around community resilience. There you are. That's what I would probably go for.
Let's call it a bill in that case, but we have to will the means as well. So the bill is the Community Resilience Act.
Yes, it would be an amendment maybe to the Civil Contingencies Act, which really underplays. I mean, I made loads of submissions to it. I have done presentations to Cabinet that have resulted in monies from time to time. But there you go. It could be the Community Resilience Act or the Civil Contingencies Act amended to give real meaning to community resilience.
Well, there you are. Now I want my magic wand back and I want you waving it around. Thank you so much for joining us. We set out to mine insights from experts. That's you. Real world case studies. We had millions of them. I'm not sure about practical tips and career advice. I think it was more acknowledging precarity for a start, and to spotlight solutions, as well as to wave the place-based innovation magic wand. And we have. Thank you for joining us, Kersten England.